Something is very wrong with modern Christianity, in my opinion. And it's not just me. I think a lot of people can feel it, even if they don't really yet have the words for it. Beneath the lights, all the slogans, the fireworks of Turning Point, the polished sermons, this sort of counterfeit warmth we've got going on, there is some kind of deeper fracture running through the modern church, something that feels very ancient and hungry and deceptive. It's a bit like that movie Alien Covenant. You can tell that it's there, but you can't quite tell what it is, right? It's something that looks kind of holy from a distance, and then when you get closer to it, it's very rotten. It's like Prometheus. Today I want to trace that fracture back to its beginning, back to Cain, back to the old rebellions, but most importantly, back to the giants and the forgotten terrors, the watchers and the monsters of the early world. I believe the moment mankind stopped treating those things as memory, as real things to fear, as real consequences of their action, and began to look at them more as just legends and myths, well, that was the moment that the door was opened for a false Christianity to essentially take root that will ultimately, in my opinion, lead us into the embrace of the Antichrist. And by the end of this, I want to show you why believing in giants and believing in Nephilim and watchers, it matters more now than ever. Because what calls itself Christian in this age may not be preparing the world for Christ at all, but instead for his imitation. And someone's got to be there to hold the door for those who would escape the grips of the false religion to come, the new one world religion that is on its way. Somebody has to keep the wolves from the door. And if not you, then who? Hey everybody, welcome back to the 21 CD podcast. As always, I am your ghost, John. If this is your first time here, welcome. We have a great show for you today. We're going to ruffle some feathers. We're going to get some panties in bunches, and we're going to talk about some giants, which is just a really fun thing to discuss, and also I think an important thing to discuss. But before we get ripping and roaring here, if you guys like this type of content, conspiracies, cryptids, sort of folklore, biblical analysis, any of that type of stuff, go ahead and shoot me a like, shoot me a share, shoot me a follow, because through that is the only way this show grows. If you are on Spotify or some other podcast channel, drop me a 5-star. And if you're on YouTube, maybe consider donating some of them hype points. If you guys want a chance to be on the show, you can submit your story over at 21cdstudios.com. There's also some merch there if you're into that sort of thing. Thank you very much. Let's get into it. A lot of people think when I talk about the one world religion, as mentioned in Revelation, that I assume this one world religion will be one that appears vastly different from Christianity. And so they leave comments like, wait till you find out the one world religion is Christianity, and a variety of other brain-dead comments about how Christianity is the real toxin on this planet, the most effective population control, the most violent religion, or any number of other things in that vein. But that is merely the projection of deceived individuals who are actually proving my very point about why the one world religion is going to look more like Christianity than any other religion. They are proving the point that Christianity itself is deceiving people away from it, okay? It is encouraging people to find alternative ways to live than those that would align with Christ. And that is the opposite of what Christianity is supposed to be. And so the Christians who will argue, oh no, we are the light bringers, we are the glory of Jesus, and we are this and that. Well, then why are so many people diverting their eyes from your brightness? Perhaps it's because you are more like a spotlight beaming into their eyes, blinding them with all the obscurities that you project, because you say you follow one sort of God, but you act completely different than that God. And nowadays you have imams preaching in churches. You have all sorts of different religions interfering with Christianity, getting it to the point where you are actually forming a one world religion that is a blend of all sorts of religions, calling itself the all-loving, all-accepting Christianity. And that is the problem. Okay? The fact of the matter is that this one world religion is more likely to look a lot like Christianity than any other religion. And it may even call itself Christianity, but it won't be real Christianity. It will be some kind of strange modern bastardization designed by the Antichrist and his cronies to deceive Christians. So it'll have to look good. And it will. It'll be like the Age of Enlightenment that began to sort of convince everybody that science was the king of the land and that all the myths and fables and stories of old were nothing but bedtime yarns for children. Okay? The New World religion will come like the Watchers of old, and it will mate with God's people, and it will create a monster, a giant that will devour all who do not bend the knee. So, how will so many Christians be deceived? And how are so many currently being deceived? Because when we hear about the Christian population growing in, let's just say, the United States, we're very much tempted to be like, this is a wonderful thing. But what if all of these modern Christians are being deceived about what Christianity even is? After Jesus came and taught and died, certainly there was a real revival in the land. The first real Christians were born because there were no Christians until after Christ. And for a while, Christians, as in the original Christians who immediately followed Christ, did a pretty okay job at spreading the word and being generally good people, right? And that was kind of before things started slipping, because inevitably things slip. And this was no exception. The good word, as developed by the ones who surrounded Jesus, who heard him teach, and who heard his disciples teach, began to decay. It began to be open for interpretation over time. And we have to go all the way back to the beginning to explain why exactly that happened and what exactly happened in the way that makes the most sense. And when I say all the way back to the beginning, I literally mean to the words in the beginning. Because even after Jesus, man forgot God pretty quickly and the true teachings of God and of Jesus. But why? Why are we so forgetful? Why do we always slip? Why do we stumble? Why do we fall? What essentially happened is that man stopped believing that giants existed and stopped believing in evil as a literal lurking presence that was waiting for their wayward steps to encounter a snare at every given moment. Man forgot that giants existed in the forest. Man forgot that there were big fucking teeth waiting to devour them. Man forgot that there were dragons out there. Man forgot that there were things that were not quite human lurking in the forest, lurking in the forbidden zones that looked a lot like them, but was triggering their uncanny valley senses, okay? And they began to look at all of those things as myths, as fables, as bedtime stories. And that is the problem. That is why we talk about cryptids on this show, That is why we talk about giants. That is why we talk about Nephilim and Watchers. Because even though we are not supposed to focus on them in a way that becomes worship, as in obsession with them, they are the tangible evil that stupid man needs in order to not slip. When Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they set the board for the rest of the human race. And it's funny how man doesn't forget that giants exist, by the way. They just say they don't exist or they never existed. But there's a greater push to say Jesus is evil these days than that giants were evil. From the biblical perspective, man does not begin in savagery. He's not some naked caveman wandering about in the wilderness. Man begins in order of elevation, an elevated status. Adam is not some grunting primitive clawing his way towards consciousness, just waiting to develop quantum physics. He is formed directly by God. He is animated by divine breath. He is placed in a garden that is already structured. It's already named and meaningful. He is given dominion, language. He's given responsibility and a hierarchy of creation that begins in heaven and descends into earth, and he gets to name all the animals too. The biblical origin of man is not the secular ascent from the mud, from some fart in the wind, into reason, but a fall from communion with God himself, the creator, into some kind of weird cover-up of that very same creator, which is where we are now. And it's, as you'll see in a second, it's where we've been for quite some time. So, if man began high and fell low, instead of the opposite, which is what they say it is, then history is not a staircase upward. It is a plummet downward. It is a ruin. It is memory degraded. It is kings becoming animals, priests becoming frauds. It is giants becoming these legends, and divine order collapsing into a literal bloodline war. But God most likely taught Adam, and therefore all of early man through Adam, the early sciences. Not the perversions we have today that they call science, but the actual way of things and how to manipulate the elements, perhaps how to do great things such as build the pyramids. All of these things that we wonder how the ancients did it, it was probably to some degree the ancient sciences that God taught Adam, and as we see, began to become corrupted through the Nephilim and the Watchers. What if that very same knowledge enabled Göbekli Tepe, Atlantis, any of those gigantic, unexplainable, megalithic structures that we say, how is it possible? What if all of that was an element of the original sciences that God taught Adam? Okay? Because that would certainly make it seem, and then, don't even get me started on the Tower of Babel, which, even though was a structure for evil, was an insane feat. Don't even get me started on the stuff that man was doing that modern man these days cannot even begin to conceptualize, and that's why they label it myth, right? What if all of that is literal evidence of a descent downwards instead of an ascent upwards? But what exactly is my argument here? What am I blabbing my skinny lips about? What am I blabbering on for? My argument is so much evil was placed in the earth within the first couple generations of man that whatever good is, according to God, has been completely eradicated from our imagination, unless looking squarely at the example of Jesus. Within the first few generations after Cain, for instance, they were already sacrificing to new gods. Cain is Adam's firstborn. So within the first few generations, they were already creating Nephilim through obscure sexual practices, which, by the way, are generally considered not something that the Watchers necessarily did to human women, but a thing human women were happy to do with the Watchers. And of course, human men also offered up their women in trade and payment, because of course they did. But this is all before the flood, only just beyond the Exodus from the Garden of Eden. So if all, in the grand scope of things, so if all that evil could come about so soon, so suddenly, after the fall of man, of Adam and Eve, how far have we fallen since then? Can you even imagine? If it only took a couple generations from Adam, a guy who literally walked with God, to descend into that madness, how far are we fallen now? Because that was so quick. There's simply no telling how far we've fallen, but I believe that one way to observe a teeny tiny, itty-bitty fraction of it is in the stories that nearly every people and culture across the whole world carry with them. The stories of giants and monsters and sky beings and floods and little people. By eliminating the stories and convincing the entire planet that all they were are mythology and bedtime tales, man explains to their children that evil just couldn't have possibly been that evil. And so we, therefore, are simply not that evil. Especially the church-going folk, because, believe it or not, most church-going folk don't seem to believe in monsters. Most church-going folk don't actually seem to believe in giants or Nephilim or the fact that demons can have a physical form. Okay? Most Christians keep that in the realm of the woo-woo because most Christians still subscribe to modern science for some reason. Science, as it should be called. Modern Christianity, in short, then, has fallen so short of the glory of God that they can't even see that they've become the very den of vipers that Jesus blessed with his righteous rage. Because that rage, it wasn't to harm people. It was to harm the construct that they were creating that was leading millions and into the billions, most likely at this point, if we're going to transcend time, all of the hosts, all of the people. It is absolutely amazing. I will say it, I'll be the first to say it. It's absolutely amazing to see so many young people turning to Christ in the modern age, especially after the weird times that we're in. It's good to see that Christ, his name is even emanating from anybody's mouths in these younger generations because their parents have failed them. And so many of our parents and grandparents have just completely failed us. But it's also a shame that the church is what it is today. And by the way, I'm in my 30s, whatever. My parents failed me. Their parents failed them too. And their parents failed them. It's a continual thing. There's no one generation or two generations that are responsible. I can already see in the comments how many of you guys are going to get so butthurt because of that. But that's not even what I'm saying. It's, if you can see, it literally is Adam's fault, okay? And it just keeps going down and down and down. But there are times within history, within the bounds of history, I should say, that the snowball rolls a little bit quicker. And lately, it has been rolling very fast. So, that being said, though it is absolutely amazing that so many young people are turning to Christ in the modern age, it is a shame that the church is what it is today. Because it is creating a bizarre Christianity that seems to be causing a lot of turmoil. And many will say that I'm part of this problem. When I was talking about the little season, I had so many comments being like, oh, you're so snobbish, you're so cocky, you're so this. Yes, I am confident in what I believe. That's what that is. I am not a typical Christian where I have to cater to everybody's opinion to make sure that all of these people who are too sensitive to experience other opinions and too sensitive to experience people who are strong in their faith and their belief, I don't have to cater to them so that my content is more palatable. But unfortunately, modern Christianity does not reflect that same vibe. So, regardless, many will say that I'm part of this problem, but this episode isn't about me. It's about giants, so I'm going to keep going. The younger generation, they lack the fundamental teachings because of many failed generations, many generations of failed parents. So, in this modern age, we are arguably the most easily manipulated. These past few generations have been really rough. We've been rapidly descending into a madness that, in my opinion, is nearing a point of no return. But so much of that is due to technology, which we'll get to. Just look at the examples of Christianity that we have today. Turning Point, a Christianity of deception and flamboyance through spectacle, led by a literal government-appointed weird witch person. The Nick Fuentes Christianity, which comes from a place of elevation and hate. The church Christianity, specifically megachurch Christianity, which accounts for over 7 million Americans. The government Christianity, which says to support the endeavors of their deviant planning, or else you don't support the will of God. These are what the kids have to guide them primarily these days. And maybe they are so susceptible because they forgot the true values of, or never learned the true values of Christ. And in order to do that, you have to remember that there were monsters and giants in the land, in my opinion. But if fathers fail to warn their children that the bedtime stories are real, the monsters in the stories are real. And that is why you have to be so strong. That is why you have to be so heroic. That is why you have to carry the torch. Then there's very little to fear. And modern entertainment even sometimes makes it kind of feel like you can be an anti-hero. Or maybe even a villain, as long as you don't trespass across certain lines. And that's just not okay. So, maybe, in part, the reason for this continued descent into deception and weakness in the Christianity world is because Christians no longer believe in giants the way that they should. And now, let's talk about Cain. Cain is the first murderer, the first man to spill human blood onto the earth. He is the first descendant of Adam. He is also the first city builder, the father of a line that is marked by wandering technological development, estrangement, and violence. And this is one of the great biblical paradoxes. Civilization itself appears in the line of the cursed brother. He murdered Abel, who was the better brother, allegedly, apparently, according to the Bible, okay? I don't mean better in the way that he was just better, but Cain killed Abel out of jealousy because Abel had a better sacrifice for God. And Cain goes east of Eden, and from him emerges Enoch, another city builder. Okay, Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. Jubal, the father of music. And Tubal-Cain, the forger of bronze and iron. In other words, one of the earliest biblical lines links exile and blood guilt and metallurgy and culture and expansion. Now, of course, he's not the only son of Adam, but all of what I just said should make anyone stop and think. The descendants of Cain are not portrayed as simple cavemen. They are portrayed as empire builders with technology and a deep understanding of metal as given to them by God. The top, okay? It can be considered brilliance severed from obedience. It can be technology without holiness. It can be the city rising in defiance of the Garden of Eden. But as we know, Cain killed Abel. And it would seem before Abel could father any children, which essentially means that a great many people alive today have a direct blood connection to Cain. Cain was also, coincidentally, the world's first psychopath, and he went on to father many psychopaths. It would appear that most of his children resembled him, okay, because he was a psychopath. We talked about psychopaths in the last episode, about the sniper safaris, and about the elite hunting their own kind. How do we know for certain that he was a psychopath when there were no modern doctors to diagnose him or perhaps coax him into a Xanax lobotomy or some other sort of transitional process? Well, because Cain didn't regret killing Abel. Even in the presence of God, he said quite literally, my punishment is too great for what I did. And one of the telltale signs of a psychopath is they don't regret killing or harming anything. And he taught his children that as well. It's interesting because his punishment wasn't even death. So even God had mercy on him in a weird way. We could argue that he was right, that his punishment was worse than death, but regardless, he still got to keep going. And instead of falling on his knees and repenting and begging for mercy, he took up war with God, and he raised his children to do the same. And this directly mirrors psychopathic behavior, especially that portrayed by our modern leaders today, the predatory class. One of Cain's sons invented musical instruments, however. Another fathered brass and ironworking, which we already said, which means that history is 100% a lie on these matters. And that's why I'm saying it again, because history, as we've been told in the history books, will tell us that we learned this over time. But according to the Bible, pretty much knew this from the beginning. We literally know who brought these things about and when, basically exactly, that they did. And just because I want to make sure that I get the point across, Cain and his descendants were not the only people on the planet. According to Genesis, Seth was born when Adam was about 130 years old. And even though the exact age of Cain is not specified, it's pretty much understood that a significant portion of this 130-year period passed between the birth of Cain and the birth of Seth, with Seth being born after Cain killed Abel. Eve kind of viewed Seth as a replacement for Abel, and that kind of suggested that Seth was born not long after the murder. But I digress. Out of Cain came Enoch, okay? The famous Enoch. And it is generally understood that Enoch was well-pleasing to God and was not found because God translated him. These are the words of Genesis as found in the Septuagint. According to the first book of Enoch, which is also known as the Ethiopic Enoch, it's dated from at least 300 BC. There's a lot of conspiracy around the books of Enoch. There are 3 books of Enoch, and some of them seem less valid than others. But according to the first book of Enoch, which appears to be the most valid of all of them, it's the only version that has been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And don't forget, like I said before, there's multiple books of Enoch, and I'm not taking this as Bible canon or anything like that. But the first book of Enoch is generally considered a sort of messianic, a sort of a distinguished text because it can be verified against messianic prophecies pertaining to the Son of Man, Jesus, which inform the claims of him and the eschatological framework of the New Testament. So Jesus, his prophecies can sort of be backed up in the book of First Enoch, and since the book of First Enoch is so old and sort of found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, all this kind of thing, this is why I even talk about it. If it was just some random book that didn't really seem to have any connection to anything, it was just sort of out there floating about, I wouldn't really mention it. I don't consider it Bible canon. I don't think it is like something that we should hinge everything we believe in on. But again, Nephilim were mentioned in what is considered Bible canon as well. And so because of all that kind of stuff, I don't mind looking at the book of First Enoch for some information, or at least some stories that back up what is already in the Bible. I digress, though. I just wanted to give reasoning for why I mention it at all in this context, because I do think it's important. But according to the first book of Enoch, as I was saying, it says, "Observe ye how the trees cover themselves with green leaves and bear fruit. Wherefore, give ye heed, and know with regard to all his works, and recognize how he that liveth forever hath made them so. And all his works go on thus, from year to year forever, and all the tasks which they accomplish for him. And their tasks change not, but according as God hath ordained, so is it done. And behold how the sea and the rivers in like manner accomplish and change not their tasks from his commandments. But ye have not been steadfast, nor done the commandments of the Lord. But ye have turned away, and spoken proud and hard words with your impure mouths against his greatness. O ye hard-hearted, ye shall find no peace." Just talking to man here. He's saying, everything else is functioning as normal. It's you, man, who is failing me. So, as we can see, by the time of Enoch, the world was pretty messed up. Nearly only evil people were inhabiting it. People who really couldn't escape the influence of Cain and his descendants because they were so overwhelming in the land, and they intermarried with all of Seth's kids and the rest of the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve who weren't as evil as Cain and his descendants. And through that marriage, that intermingling, they created an environment where eventually only Noah was the good one left. But the point is that men were not only susceptible to evil influence, but that they didn't give a shit about God at all. Like, at all. They openly lived in evil ways and didn't even know that they were evil because they had nobody to teach them right from wrong, because all of their fathers and forefathers were quite literally psychopaths who hated God. Okay? That is how that happened. This is all before the flood. So if we got that bad before the flood, where the heck are we now? So, fast forward a little bit. The jealous watchers, also known as the fallen angels by some, the sons of God by others, according to the work of Timothy Alberino, who sums it up nicely. I like the way he worded it. You can verify all of this in the book of Enoch and the Bible and all this kind of stuff, all these different texts, but Timothy Alberino has a nice modern way of phrasing it. He says, "The defection of the watchers, though provoked by lust, was not entirely impulsive. They had a plan. By copulating with the women of earth, they could produce their own offspring who might be human enough to inherit Adam's birthright." And there it is. It wasn't just horny angels in heaven who were like, dang, look at the badonk on that one. That's not what it was. They wanted Adam's birthright. But what is Adam's birthright? Adam's birthright, as the first man created directly by God, was to bear the divine image. It was to exercise dominion over the earth and enjoy direct fellowship with God in the Garden of Eden. It represented his role as the head of humanity and heir to the spiritual and physical blessings of God's creation. Alberino goes on the half-breed sons of the Watchers, inexorably superior to their human cousins in every way, would seize the thrones of men and establish their own kingdoms, which their fathers would rule by proxy. And listen, we're still seeing that today. We know we're seeing that today. Look at all of the secret organizations that run this planet, the cults. Look at the people that are in power. Look, follow the bloodline, follow the money, follow all of that, and you will see that that statement is true. Just want to give you guys a reminder, if you're still watching this, please give me a like. It takes 2 seconds of your time. You don't even have to pause the video. You can just do it right now while I'm talking. I'm not talking about anything important right now anyway, so you can just go down there and give me a like. Maybe leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking so that I can improve, or so whatever. You could tell me what you think about this video, what your opinion is, because your opinions matter. I actually learn a lot from your guys' opinions in the comments because it encourages me to go down further rabbit holes and do more research of my own. So yeah, if you guys are listening still, that would be great. That is, the most that I can ask for, because I'm not begging for money or anything, but to get your support, that boosts me in the algorithm, and that is very valuable to me. So thank you so much. Let's get back to it. There seemed to be a sort of catch to this deviant plan that the Watchers hatched to steal Adam's birthright. There was a consequence for their actions that was going to be basically immediately felt, it would seem. It was a risk that even Semyaza was worried about, who's sort of considered to be one of the head fallen angels, the head Watchers, okay? And it appeared that it was possible that in order to breed with human women, the Watchers were forced to abandon some facet of their higher nature and to fix themselves to the constraints of the human condition. And support for this hypothesis could be cited in the book of Jude, where their sexual exploits are likened to those of the Sodomites and Gomorrites, who were in the habit of going after so-called strange flesh. We see that in the book, or in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The word abode in that passage is oikaterion in the Greek, which I'm probably saying wrong, but it is this word in the Greek, which is commonly used to describe a bodily residence and only appears in one other passage, which is in the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians 5, which says, "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." Okay? That's where that other word appears, which seems to symbolize some sort of other home, some sort of other realm. And that same word is the word for abode that the Watchers were going to have to abandon to commit their atrocities upon mankind. The verse goes on, 2 Corinthians 5 goes on, "For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven, if indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked." So the Watchers did the thing. They were like, okay, worth it. That bedonk be crazy. And down they went. First Enoch then goes on in chapter 7, "And the angels, the children of heaven, took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bore great giants. And they consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them, and devoured mankind, and they began to sing against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood." So there you have it. Their union, these Watchers, these fallen ones, these children of heaven, these sons of God, their union produces the Nephilim. Gary Wayne calls them the Son of God in his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You know, that's kind of where I'm getting that from. And he argues that you can follow that through the Bible to kind of see the story of these fallen ones, these angels. But their union produces the Nephilim, these giant offspring, these violent beings of corrupted stature and appetite. And Enoch describes them not as these noble demigods, but as devourers. They consume the efforts and the labor of men, and then they consume the men themselves. They turn to bloodshed. They teach forbidden arts. They create witches and warlocks. They pollute creation. And the Watchers themselves corrupt humanity as well by revealing the hidden things out of season. The enchantments, the root cuttings, astrology, the weapon making, the cosmetics, the different types of metallurgy that were forbidden, that were sort of given as a side effect of the knowledge of good and evil, the sorcery. And all of this is devastating to humanity. It's like essentially Red 40. That the dye that destroys your body. It's like you want the candy, you want the sweetness, but the Red 40 is going to give you cancer. And that cancer is going to fester over a long period of time, and then you are going to fucking die from it. So, knowledge detached from obedience in this situation clearly doesn't elevate man. It destroys him. It mutates him. And I believe that it was at this time that the Nephilim began to steal the divine sciences from man and began to replace them with these hack job versions that we have now, keeping the real power of the sciences that were given to Adam by God for themselves. Okay? And the Watchers, of course, were in on this. They were perpetrating this. And ever since then, this is why it's important to believe in giants. Ever since then, man has been attempting to claw their way back from the abysmal ways of misunderstanding nature and how to hold dominion over the earth. From a biblical perspective, there are notable parallels between the lineage of Cain and the Watchers. Tubal-Cain is identified in Genesis as a pioneering figure in the metallurgy. So we know when all of that came about, and that's how we can sort of discredit history if you look at things through the biblical lens, as I do. Obviously, there are going to be so many people who disagree with that because of modern archaeology and all of the sciences that we have today. They're going to discredit that at all, but I am a spiritual person. I believe in the Bible, and so the Bible provides the baseline for my history. And so we know that Tubal-Cain is identified as a pioneering figure in metallurgy. He was credited with forging bronze and iron. But in 1st Enoch, Azazel receives condemnation for imparting knowledge regarding the manufacture of swords and knives and armor and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we see how the sciences are being manipulated. And who knows, when you're not focused on manufacturing weapons, what sort of things you could be manufacturing. I think that's part of the whole thing, really. So whether one interprets these accounts as directly related or, sort of thematically aligned, a few recurring elements begin to emerge. There's this bloodline separation. There's this forbidden knowledge that is introduced. It's not necessarily like knowledge of how to produce. It's more like you already have the knowledge of how to produce, but I'm going to teach you to produce things you shouldn't produce with that knowledge. And then pretty soon you're going to get sidetracked on just producing this stuff that I told you shouldn't produce, and you're going to forget all about the amazing stuff that you were producing before. Okay? So we get all these advancements in these technologies, from these sciences. And it begins to become a manipulated bastardization of what God intended them to be used for, okay? We get these weird magics. We get these weird technologies. We get this ornamentation, we get violent acts, we get the expansion of civilization in the wrong way. And these are all prominently featured in early narratives about the beginnings of the post-Eden era. This is easy to see. You can even read about it all over in ancient texts, but you can also read about it in the Bible. We have traditional stories concerning demonic smiths, hazardous metals, illicitly acquired knowledge that may represent pagan traditions, echoing themes found more explicitly within Scripture. We have human innovation flourishing after the fall. However, we have to remember, we have to know, we have to understand, and this is why the bedtime stories are important. We have to remember and know it is real that much of this development occurred in circumstances that were marked by exile and curse, following significant violence. So much of these things were perpetrated by the monster under your bed, by the witch in the cabin in the woods, okay? By the general who tells you God wills it, etc. And only after all of this did Noah enter the scene to clear the board, but not completely. Based on biblical genealogies in Genesis, the flood occurred approximately 1,656 years after the creation of Adam. And this timeline is calculated by adding the ages of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah at the time their sons were born, and adding the 600 years of Noah's life until the flood. We can break it down real quick. I'm going to do it real quick because genealogy can be boring and mind-numbing, but the Bible gives us this. And so we even have a timeline, okay? According to the biblical calculation, the timeline is calculated as Adam to Seth, about 130 years, Seth to Enosh, about 105, Enosh to Canaan, 90, Canaan to Mahalalel, 70, Mahalalel to Jared, 65, Jared to Enoch, 162, Enoch to Methuselah, 65, Methuselah to Lamech, 187, and then Lamech to Noah, about 182 years, and then Noah's age at the flood, which is about 600, which equals roughly 1,656 years, which in context places the flood sometime around 2,348 year BC in many traditional literal interpretations, such as Ussher's chronology. So we have a timeline. Based on the Bible chronology, the Great Flood, Noah's flood, is calculated to have occurred approximately about 4,500 years ago, generally cited around 23 to 2,500 BC. Okay, and there's more perspectives. You know, like you could look at some of the geological or mythological theories that suggest that earlier potential dates are around 3,000 BC or 12,000 years ago even, following the last ice age. But the amazing thing about the Bible is it works no matter how old you think the planet is or how long you think we've been here. So for all the bros in the comments who are going to provide alternate timelines and whatever, that's just fine. Because to be quite frank, in this particular case, the older the Earth is, the older humanity is, the more this argument makes sense. The argument is that if evil can be that bad within the first 1,600 years from Adam, look how bad it is, and look how bad it could possibly be now. But like the descendants of Cain, we don't even realize how far we've fallen. We don't even realize how evil we are. Let's get to the giants. This is why it is important to ask the question, what if the old stories were never just stories at all? They were memories. They were broken memories that were distorted by time, by rituals, by the telling over and over again, by fear, by bloodline, by deception. They were memories that were handed down from people who had literally seen and fought these things that now, in the modern age, we are no longer permitted to believe in. Things like the Fae, trolls, giants, goblins, dwarves, hobbits, cyclopes, the whole ancient bestiary. We are told these belong to fantasy. But why? And if so, how do they persist? We continue to make modern movies about these things. The memory of them continues, and I think that is a gift from God. I think that is Him being like, I am using them against them. By you remembering these stories, these legends, if you want to call them that, these myths, these fake stories, by you remembering these, I am keeping you secretly close to what you should fear, so that at any given moment, as soon as you realize the stories are true, you can remember the fear your ancestors felt, and then you will remember God. Okay? Once you move these beings, these monsters, out of fiction and back into history, the entire human story begins to change. It begins to correct itself, and it becomes much darker, much stranger and more violent, and most definitely more honest, which is what I go for on this show. Because across all the myths and sagas and legends and all of the oral traditions, the stories told around campfires and in warm beds on winter evenings and all the folklore, the same image keeps surfacing, like the bones that the Smithsonian dumped in the ocean. The bones, they say, are nothing but medically explainable biological malfunctions from ancient, distorted, one-off beings, a people with gigantia or something that was just a medical anomaly or some weird explanation. If that's the case, why do the bones keep disappearing? If there's a guy with gigantia playing in the NBA and he dies, are you going to destroy his bones? The fact of the matter is humans were not alone. They were surrounded. They were pressed in on by entities that looked like them but were not them. These humanoid beings that were wrong. These human-shaped entities that carried some kind of flaw in their frame, some kind of corruption in the face, some alien thing in their eyes. And sometimes they appeared as giants. Absolutely. We know this because the Bible tells us so. And they were perhaps fewer in number. They were perhaps larger and more powerful, cannibalistic, sometimes living in caves, as in the Lovelock situation. Absolutely. Look at Iceland, where they still tell these stories publicly as if they were real. But the giants weren't the only humanoids in the land. Humans should be thought of as a species that were overwhelmed. And that's probably one of the reasons that the flood had to happen, is because the planet was filled with these humanoid, non-human beings who were fucking everything up. And also, men were so evil that they didn't understand how that was a problem. So if you look through the biblical lens, the giants then aren't taboo, they're not out of place, they're common knowledge. Genesis 6 mentions the Nephilim before the flood. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. We've heard it 1,000 times. But the giant problem doesn't vanish after the flood. It echoes back in to the post-diluvian world, which means we didn't escape them. Which means however much they corrupted man before the flood, they continued to do so after the flood. When we get the Anakim, we get the Raphaim, we get the Amim, the Zamzamim, we get Og of Bashan with his enormous bedstead where he was performing breeding rituals. We get Goliath and his brothers. The biblical world still remembers the giants. But for some reason, most Christians will not accept them. Why? And when all these later nations speak of the mountain beings and the cave dwellers and the cannibal kings and these monstrous tribes and ancient foes, maybe they're not inventing stories for their children or speaking in parables about problems of large proportions. Okay? And then we have this concept of, I'm going to call it the Horde because I've heard it referenced that before. Think about Lord of the Rings with all of the orcs, right? This is where the orc archetype really resonates. But look away from the fantasy form, even though a lot of people say that Tolkien was speaking kind of prophetically when he was talking about Lord of the Rings. But look away from that for a second. It depicts a large group of hostile humanoids that were perceived as less advanced, less refined than us. The mutating didn't work. These things are disgusting compared to man, still. Okay? But they're far greater in number, they're more aggressive, and they're absolutely famished and unyielding. We see in fantasy art these things constantly. It constantly revisits the scenario of an overwhelming force of orcs or these gargoyles, these weird humanoid non-humans that are trying to overwhelm humanity. But I don't think this is just for spectacle. I think this taps into a profound human fear. The dread of being overtaken by outside forces. The threat of the enemy mass, the bloodthirsty horde, the enemies that are at the gate, that are clawing at the walls, that are climbing up it, that are on our pinnacles of our buildings, and this belief that the strongest defenses can even be breached if you're not diligent and careful, and if you don't get rid of them, if you don't eradicate them like rats, like rodents. And I think this sheds light on the uncanny valley, this discomfort that we have with almost human-like, this human-like non-human figures that I don't think are such a new phenomenon, but more of like an ancient adaptive response to something that we have been going through since before the flood. This instinctive revulsion could literally stem from some kind of survival mechanism that has been passed down from before the flood. It's like this inherited memory that's warning us against beings that look nearly human but aren't quite trustworthy. That's why I talk about NPCs all the time, because they are NPCs and they are among us. They are non-player characters, NPCs. They are human-like non-humans. They are background entities. They're trying to steal the birthright, but not intentionally, really. They're just out here polluting everything like rodents. And this is where all the different links and subspecies of human and the generations of man come from. They're digging up according to science, they're digging up all these versions of man, not once figuring perhaps they can be attributed to the hordes of humanoid non-humans, these NPCs that were on the face of the planet, and not all of the evolutionary links of man as he becomes Homo sapien. When you start looking at it from this perspective, or at least when I do, again, all of this is opinion, okay? Researched opinion, but opinion. But when you look at it from this perspective, I continue to be unconvinced by the increasingly prevalent portrayal of prehistory as a period that is marked primarily by harmonious exchange and this sort of peaceful coexistence among early human population. Evidence seems to suggest that this era, when all of these quote-unquote links, all of these different versions of man that they begin to, they say are our ancestors, that are stages of our evolution, from Tadpole to Donald Trump, they kind of say that we all exist in this sort of cohesion. And I see articles coming out a lot these days about how the different links were like copulating and creating different types of babies and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, what? No. More likely than that is that on the face of the planet, when all of these mongoloids were running about trying to distort what man was, there was intense competition. There were raids. There were entire wars between mankind and the mongoloids that we're not even told about in history, but we are told about in myth, and we are told about in legends, and we are told about in stories. And they were predatorial, they were territorial, there was selective breeding going on, there was cannibalism, and this was all driven by the fundamental imperative of survival. Okay? And rather than a straightforward conflict between these distinct groups, the period more than likely involved complex and widespread interactions among multiple hominin species. And they're all striving for dominance and the opportunity to essentially shape humanity's future. But of course, we prevailed. Here we are. We prevailed. Although there are still NPCs among us, most likely. My opinion, okay? Just ever more evolved than their ancestors, though not as much as man, as created in God's image. And that's a hot take, but it is what it is. Once we acknowledge that humanity's past included several other humanoid species, the taboo surrounding this idea begins to fade. They're telling us they exist. It's not like the giant bones where they say it's all fake. And if it's not all fake, it's like a one-off birth defect. It's not like that, where they dump them into the ocean or they order farmers to destroy them, don't even report them to the Smithsonian, as they did in the early days of this country. It's not like that. They tell us about all of these different links that eventually became us, okay? So when you look at it from this way, it doesn't begin to feel so weird to believe in giants. It's now kind of widely accepted, for instance, that our ancestors were also familiar with a sort of little person. Okay, there was a like hobbit version of us before we became this. It's called the Homo floresiensis or something like that. Literally a hobbit. Then you got the Neanderthals. You got all these guys, okay? They're all part of this story. The history of humans is more complex. It's more amazing. It's crowded. It's unpredictable. I mean, look how big the Earth is. Look how many of us there are now. Look how the population of the planet. Imagine it filled with these types of things. Because it was. That's why it was so bad. Our history becomes almost mythic, right? Oh, wait, perhaps the myths are history. So instead of asking if these other humanoids existed, the real questions become how many were there? Because we're finding them all the time. We're finding their footprints in the mud. We're finding their skulls and their bones everywhere. They're like dog turds in the yard if you don't clean it up. New York just experienced this because New York is overtaken by NPCs. They just let their dogs shit all over the sidewalk, and then the snow comes, it covers all the shit up, and then when the snow melts, you got nothing but turds all over the roads and the sidewalks. That's what it's like, finding their bones and their skulls everywhere. So what were these things like? And could memories of them have shaped the mythological beings that we talk about today? If they found hobbit-like ancestors of ours, or at least a hobbit-like species that we lived beside in the past, which they have no problem saying we did, why are giants all of a sudden out of the question? Because they reveal the truth. They are the key. We're not scared of the hobbits. The giants, that's scary. The monsters, that keeps us out of the woods at night. That makes us go to bed on time. That makes us not stray too far from the village. The hobbits, I can punt a hobbit if I want to. A giant's punting me. Okay? And that's why they're the key. Now, if we move back into these old ages, into the strange chronology preserved by ancient writers, into Hesiod's heroic age, those sort of transitional worlds after the Bronze Age and before the decline into the Iron Age, according to the manipulated timeline that we've been given to follow so that we forget all of this stuff, then we enter a territory of ancient people that is also unstable, and it's filled with humanoids and hybrids that are not fully divine, but not fully human. It's this violent in-between. This was a world that was crowded with giants. It was crowded with beasts and hybrids, strange lineages, wild remnants, gods that were intermingling with men and creating these demigods, these half-human beasts. Things like Medusa, things like Hercules. And the heroic age relied on men, okay? They relied on men to be heroic. Not because it was poetic to be heroic, but because survival itself required heroism. I heard this concept in another YouTube video recently. I just thought it was so good. Because one of the things that Christians have lost is the sense of heroism. Where are our heroes? Where are they? There are no heroes in Christianity anymore. Being a hero these days is very dangerous, but that is the whole point of being a hero. Nobody else is going to do it, so you got to do it. And I think that's important to remember. And you know, all the modern movies, we can't escape the stories of these giants and these monsters. We continue to make new movies about them all the time. Our entertainment evolves around them. We continue to regurgitate the same ideas. Isn't it funny how there's never any new ideas in entertainment anymore? It's always demons. It's always giants. It's always monsters in the woods. It's always something under the bed or in the closet. It's always the glowing eyes or the sunken eyes, the long fingers, the cannibals. It's always the same. And that to me is the key. These stories endure because of the everlasting impact that they have on the human brain. The human brain is hardwired to be spooked by these things, to be cautious of these things. They endure because they are historical. They are part of our DNA. The fact of the matter is, we were not alone. And here's why it's important for Christians to believe in giants. I know that probably only a fraction of you have persisted this long, but this is why it's important. And as Alberino puts it, again, I'm going to return to his words. This is coming from his book, Birthright. And I'm using his words because I also believe what he says, not because he convinced me to believe this. I do my own research, and I use the Bible and ancient texts as the foundation for what I believe. I don't need modern writers to tell me what I believe. But he puts it in he puts the words down to the page the way that makes sense, and that I feel like is the real clincher to an episode like this. So he says, if the sons of Adam were to be persuaded, once again, to willfully relinquish their birthright in a second advent of the Golden Age, then it was imperative that they be made to forget the cataclysmic consequences of the first period. Lyell and Darwin had succeeded in unfettering the mind of man from the age-old mooring of theism and divine accountability, opening before him an ocean of evolutionary potential. By denying the existence of the Maker, men could now act with impunity according to the doctrine of a new religion that impels them to cast off the image of Adam and become the gods of their own design. The tenets of this new religion, conceived in the womb of Darwinism and merged with great violence in the 20th century, roiling in the effusion of natal blood, came forth with eugenics, with racism and concentration camps, with gulags, with death squads, with hundreds of millions of lives lost across Europe and Asia. More men died in war and democide, which is death by government, in the century following Darwin than in all of human history combined. God was no longer to be feared. Man would define his own morality. Only survival and propagation, biological and political, mattered in the grand scheme of things. The earth belonged to the fittest. And what do we say? Survival of the fittest. The turn of the century was marked by an unprecedented acceleration in scientific breakthrough and technological development. The atom was modeled and split. Quantum theory was formulated. High-voltage electricity illuminated cities and powered industry. Automobiles and airplanes propelled by internal combustion traversed the land and sky. Warfare was mechanized. It was mechanized with tanks and mobile artillery. Telephones and radio transmissions made long-distance communication instantaneous. X-rays were discovered, vaccines, antibiotics, anesthetics, they were all developed. The nucleotide bases of DNA were identified, and genetic research commenced. Never before had knowledge advanced so prolifically on planet Earth. This was the era of the Wright brothers, of Edison and Tesla and Ford and Curie and Castle and Planck and Bohr and Oppenheimer and Einstein, to name a few of its luminaries. But it was also the era of Blavatsky and of Nietzsche and of Crowley. Listen, people. This is what I'm going to close with. There is a spiritual sensuality that we have to be cautious of. There is a romantic tongue that they use against the people, but it lacks the true feeling of oneness with God. When people claim to not feel God in Christianity, it is because he is not there. He is not there because these entities have been lulled by a spiritual sensuality into a play realm of the demons. The devil is the one who provides comfort. The devil is the one who lulls us into the feather bed in this situation. Christianity is not supposed to make us feel better. Christianity is a struggle. If there is a struggle, you know you're doing it right. The psychopaths, the ones who feel no struggle, they're not doing it right. They might be NPCs. The struggle, being a real Christian, is as a blade shedding its burrs on the sharpening stone. Faith is not palatable with this world. It is seen as a poison in this world. But that is why we are told to merely be in the world and not of the world. It is the world that is the poison. And yet, because of how toxic it has become, anything that is not poison is seen as the threat. Be in the world and not of it, lest we take on a role within one of these conglomerates of counterfeits that Christianity likes to act as. When you really think about it, real Christians are here to prepare the world for the coming Antichrist and to be distinctly different from what the Antichrist will appear as, which is godly and holy. We have to guard ourselves against the deception that is to come. And one way to do that, in my opinion, one of the main ways to do that, is to believe in giants, to believe in dragons and monsters, because these Christianity complexes don't and won't. After all, by acknowledging the history of the Bible as truth and the messages within as literal, they are forced to stare directly at the horrors of what they are, and the horrors of what is coming, and the horrors of what has been. This is something that many modern Christians have an extremely hard time doing. Christians, muscle up, become heroes, start believing in monsters again, because they coming for you. Wake up. The life is in the blood. Thanks for watching.